Welcome back to DM Gives Inspiration and the final episode of Season 7, a mailbag episode. I received these questions via the website at kylefergusson.com, 2S's in Fergusson, on my Twitter at kylefergusson, and via the Discord, which you can find a link to on the website as well. The first question comes from Tyler, who says, I may have accidentally said I'll DM. I'm in huge trouble. I have no experience, just a theater degree, and 8 years of improv training. I'm scared. I bought Lost Minds and am watching tons of videos. My books come tomorrow. I told them that I need a month to get going. I'm mainly concerned that I don't know the rules all that well. Alright, so you have a couple of legs up in this situation already. You've done some theater training, so you know what it's like to be nervous and to get over it. That's a big hurdle. You've also seen people play in these videos, and you're going to have friends DM for you before the point in time where you perform. In all honesty, you probably know more rules than you think you do. You understand the flow of the game from watching other Dungeon Masters. That is a huge part of the oral tradition that is Dungeons & Dragons. It's really hard to extract that from the books. But it is true that you're likely missing some rules, because each game only shows off the rules that are needed for that game. So step 1 to have a calm first session is to get your players to create their characters as soon as possible. Once you know what classes you're playing with, you can start doing research into their individual abilities. Dive into their character sheets looking for questions. If you have a warlock, how do their spells work? What is a short rest? What does that constitute? How long is that? Does your wizard cast a charm effect? What is charm? Who is resistant to charm? An important aside here, if your players are creating their characters early, ignore their backstories for now. Most players have a tendency to change their backstories in the final week before play as they really start to invest in that upcoming game. Backstories can have an influence on the kind of world you run, how you're going to plan out the session in a lore sense, but focus on your first adventure establishing the world you want to play in, that you would enjoy, running the types of monsters you find interesting. Now you mentioned in your message here that you bought the Lost Minds of Phandelver. That's going to select your monsters for you, and you're going to read descriptions straight out of the booklet. So now you would attack those monsters and those locations in very much the same way with the same curiosity that you investigated your players' characters. And the super good news for you is that the Part 1 Goblin Arrows of Lost Minds has been done many times online, so you can actually look up Goblin Arrows and find actual play sessions of that being conducted, with many different group types. So ultimately, it's like learning anything, particularly self-taught learning. You have to have the right questions, so you can get the right answers. And the best way to have those questions is to investigate your player sheets and the monsters, and make connections between the various rules there. Any rules beyond that are just going to fill your head with gunk, so don't learn them right now. This is the same reason you wouldn't draw a world map for your very first session, because it's just a lot of information your players don't need, and you don't need to worry about. Your biggest hurdle is going to be the digital play space, running it online. In person, people expect pauses. They share snacks, they share conversations. Online, you have to be swift enough to maintain attention and energy. So if you're interested, you can purchase Lost Minds of Phandelver on Roll20, so it's already set up there. It's also available on Fantasy Grounds. So while you wait for your players to get their characters to you, start investigating how you're going to run the digital tabletop. And Oluvatar, pardon my pronunciation of the internet name, asks, writing adventures. How do you gauge an adventuring day? I don't want to overwhelm my players, but I'd like them to feel stretched. A great question. Something I think all DMs aim for. A bit of stress and drama. You want to see your players sweating. One difficulty here is you don't know if your players are actually stressed. Some go quiet, some act perfectly fine, and only when the adventure is over do they say, wow, I was worried. I thought you had us there. Reaching that sweet spot depends a lot on your group and your setting or world. If your group is very short rest heavy, they like to take short rests, or they have lots of abilities that reset on a short rest, it's going to be very difficult to drain them down. Only upon reaching that third short rest of the day do they start to feel like their hit dice are running out, that they lack resources to keep going, and then they're going to start looking for that long rest. So your job with that group becomes finding a way to limit their short rests. And this can feel pretty cheap if not done organically. You could put a limit of 2 short rests per day. After all, each short rest is an hour long. If they take 2 hours worth of breaks in the middle of the day, they're not going to get a lot of adventuring done. There is no rule on limiting short rests, though the designers have said that they expect each day of adventuring to have about 2 short rests in it. When it comes to long rests, there is a rule. You can only long rest once in a 24-hour period. You may have a situation come up where your players awaken to an attack and immediately want to go right back into recovering those abilities they used. They're not sleepy. They have to wait around all day in order to get back to another long rest, which they might choose to do, which would be very, very lame of them. And that's where your world comes in. Your missions need time limits to be completed in. There has to be a set amount of days, punishments for things left undone. Towns get destroyed, evil wins out over good. What is keeping the adventurers moving in a timely manner? You also might choose to interrupt their rests if they're doing it in a dangerous area like a forest or a dungeon. Wilderness encounters, patrols, all could stop your players from getting those hit dice back, resetting their spells, and keep the drama going. But again, you would want to be tame with those sort of things and not use them all the time. It is a tool in your toolbox to be used rarely. But most players don't try to game the system. They want to interact with the story, they want to be a part of the world, so they keep things moving. In that case, it's all about studying their sheets, knowing what your players can do, and get them to spend those various spells and abilities. Players really start feeling the stress of an adventure when they look at their sheets and they see all the boxes filled, all of their abilities on cooldown. So dig into those sheets and really find situations where you can get them to use them, possibly outside of combat. Fireball is a level 3 spell, but so is Dispel Magic. Can you add a puzzle, a room, a situation in the dungeon where your wizard can use Dispel Magic? Now they're down a fireball, making that next encounter more difficult. If you're going to give your players things like healing potions or items that help them recover spells or health, account for those in your dungeon design as well. Make things more difficult to get those uses out of them. When it comes to combat, here's my formula. You have a first trial combat. Something bombastic, very short, maybe a single monster is introduced. In that players versus one monster situation, they get to know a little bit about the monster, what its abilities are, how to defeat it. Next combat, they fight multiples of that monster, but they're poorly positioned. Or they attack one at a time, but the stress builds. Around then, they're going to want to do their first short rest. In the third combat, you're using the same amount of monsters, the same monster from your first combat and your second combat, but now they're properly positioned. The archers have high ground. The enemies attack at the same time. Stealth creatures spring their traps. This will wear them down quite a bit, but they still get to use the knowledge that they built along the adventuring day. And then finally is the boss, something new and scary that pushes your players to their limits now that you've drained all their resources up to that point. Zactastrophe asks, when and how do you start utilizing time skips and fast travel? How do you determine what happens to the party over that time? In my opinion, time jumps are just too hard to pull off in the middle of play. I would never start a play session at one point in time and then skip ahead 3 years without advance notice for the players. Time skips are best when you're going to have a natural break from your own play sessions. Let's say you can't play D&D for a month. If you tell the players you're going to skip ahead 3 years, they now have something to think about that entire month you're off. It keeps people invested, imagining in your world, wondering what's next, and how they can influence it with their character choices. Start up some text chains, message people the week before you rejoin, and start getting those backstories, forward stories, what they got up to during that time of your skip. Even if you're just going to do a short skip, like a week, make sure you do it outside of the play session, so players get to enjoy those imaginings. Now, you really don't have to come up with much at all except for what the bad guys are doing during that time, what they're planning and scheming. The players provide the rest, and it's a great opportunity for cooperative world building. I would even call a long rest a time jump. I really try to avoid them in the middle of a session. I want my players to maintain the feeling, maintain their personalities for a day. From the moment they wake up to the moment they go to sleep, they are under the effects of the stress of that day. In the real world, sleep is this big reset. You drop a lot of your stresses from the previous day, start to move on. So if a character is angry, then you break, come back a week later, and continue the play session, that player may not maintain their personality anymore. The player has reset. Their character shouldn't have, but by nature of them being away from the character, they've reset their emotions. In fact, you could even go on to say that I work on kind of a Saturday morning cartoons feel, and I'm talking about the 90s, early 2000s. There was very rarely a two-parter. Previously on X-Men, if said, was a big deal. Things were going down in that show, and you better pay attention week to week. But mostly they were single episodes that could stand alone. Not necessarily one-shots, those are really hard to plan and structure. But each mission is a complete day, and we respect any time jump, even if it's 8 hours. Personal preference there, though. When it comes to fast travel, I like to treat the world as safe once cleared. Random encounter tables just make for messy adventures that tonally don't really know where they're going. Plus, if we're thinking about environment, flora and fauna, societies, it's kind of weird to have goblins suddenly show up on the road if there's not resources available to sustain that goblin horde. So plan out your travel to have interesting events along the way. Try to keep combat to a minimum, ideally just one combat on that travel, because they will likely travel for a distance that allows for multiple rests, and we're not going to stress them out. This is more about flavor. An encounter on the road should give your world a bigger feel, not necessarily push them to the limits like a dungeon would. Now with that path cleared, from the town to the city, we can fast travel back and forth regularly, though you would still want world reasons, story reasons, why they might not want to teleport all around Skyrim crazy style. The player character would disappear for too long, would not be able to take part in an upcoming event. Kilmonarch asks, I've always struggled in dealing with established worlds. My biggest pain point are the histories of races, cultures of each kingdom, wars fought, etc. Is there a Cliff Notes for established worlds lore, or do I have to suck it up and read +5 fiction books? If reading books would be helpful to you, yes. If you're the kind of person that would readily absorb that knowledge from reading a book, it is going to be helpful. However, I find the best way to at least get acquainted with a world is to type Faerun timeline into the internet and see what I get. Go around to many different sites, line up the dates, and start to build my own version of that world, where I want to place my party in the timeline. What kind of events do I want to run? And as those dates become personalized, part of your world now, you can use the rest of that information as suggestions or restrictions to make sure your world still feels like Faerun. Ultimately though, unless your players are going to call you out, just use those pre-established worlds as a framework, inspiration for you to make a world you would enjoy. If it's available, focus on the smaller books that compartmentalize the different topics rather than the overall campaign source books, which can be completely overwhelming. So if you want to run Eberron, don't start with the book Eberron Rising from the Last War. That thing's really complex. Instead, pick yourself up Wayfinder's Guide to Eberron, because that's more based on the races and classes interacting with the world. And that's what your players are going to experience first, not pages and pages of lore. They want to see how they act in that world. Choose a location, figure out its history, its cultures, make it bite-sized for yourself. You can always expand it after the first adventure is completed. Harry asks our final question. I've been running a 4-person campaign for over a year now. It is my first campaign as DM, and entirely a homebrew setting. However, due to circumstances, I believe the game is probably about to end prematurely, due to the potential loss of a couple of players. The narrative would struggle without these players, so I'm reluctant to plow ahead without them. How should I handle this? I have debated using my current world, but without a conclusion to the current story, it's not really doable. Do you have any advice for helping move on from your first setting and getting the creative juices flowing on something new? Specifically, I was thinking of a steampunk campaign. No matter what you choose to do here, you need an ending. The current adventure must come to a close. The players may choose to continue on after that, or you might start up this new steampunk campaign. Either way, the players that are taking off deserve an ending, and you need to give them one. It's okay if it's rushed, if it's a little tight. Restructuring your schedule, moving away, is already a pretty big deal. During these real-life times, players have a lot going on. They're not going to begrudge you speeding things along in the game. So ask the remaining players what they want. If they want to stay in this world, after the exit of the other players, let's make sure those leaving players' backstories are at least wrapped up in a sense. Focus heavily on their needs, what gives them conclusion. Some players like a nice heroic death on their way out. Some like to retire, get married, whatever gives their character peace. Conclusion. The players that remain, leave their backstories open. This should be a thrilling climax for them. It should fulfill their need for the quest. But there's no urgency to tie up all the loose ends in one big go. You do not have to really stuff and cram this final session. But what do you want? Do you want to keep playing in this world? Or are you suffering from a sunk cost fallacy? Have you put so much time, resources, into building this homebrew setting? Do you fear your time will feel wasted if you stepped away? That's not a healthy reason to keep going. You keep going in this world because it brings you joy, because you're happy doing it, not because you planned it already. And it sounds like you have an idea you really want to pursue with steampunk. So start small there. Ask simple questions. Does your world have guns? Are they based on steam? Are they pneumatic? Are the steam engines magical, or do they need regular water fill-ups? How does water work in your world as such a valuable resource? And each question will lead to another question, which leads to another question. And when you go back and look at all your factual statements you've lined up about this world you're building, you'll paint a pretty clear picture of what you've created. Then you can judge, does this interest me more than my previous homebrew setting? You could also read books and movies about steampunk, but this is really a personal choice for you as DM about what brings you joy. The players will enjoy playing. You need to enjoy dungeon mastering. And with that question, we conclude the final episode of Season 7, DM Gives Inspiration. I want to thank you all for listening and joining me for this season. There will be a Season 8, and it'll start in late February. During that time, I will be hard at work over at There Will Be Dungeons on the Frog Pants Network, DMing a 12-episode campaign. If you would like more inspiration while we're on break, head on over to KyleFergusson.com, 2 S's in Fergusson, and find the new mini-adventure, The Bridge Beast, a small travel event featuring a mimic and a rust monster. Those are edited, formatted, and thankfully spell-checked by Kristen Ashton. Music here was by Brian Griffith, and I will see you all for Season 8 of DMGI in a few weeks.